Hello brothers, this is Justin with Masonic Improvement. Today I'm going to talk about why I believe Freemasonry's membership numbers are in decline. Before I get started, I told you I was going to start recommending books with every video. So with this video, I strongly recommend Observing the Craft by Brother Andrew Hammer. It is a fantastic book. I mean, it has been on my to-read list for a very long time, and I've just got around to it. And wow, I mean, if you followed Masonic Improvement for any period of time, if you agree with many of the things I've talked about, then you will really enjoy this book. I'll put a link down below if you want to check it out. I highly recommend it. It belongs in every brother's bookshelf. It belongs in every lodge. Check it out. Okay. I'm a little antsy about this video because it's kind of hard to talk about. And when I wrote the blog piece that accompanies this, I kept having to go back and rewrite everything because I felt as though I was coming across very strongly. I felt as though I was giving the wrong impression with the content of my post. And I just want to put a little disclaimer in here right now. It is not my intention to bash on anybody in the fraternity. I'm not trying to make anybody sound as though they're the bad guy. I'm not trying to downplay any generation. I'm not trying to upplay any generation. I'm just sharing the facts as I am interpreting them, and I'm sharing what I believe is the problem for our decline. I'm not going to talk about solutions, and so I'm just going to present the information. How you want to handle it is for you to decide. If you even want to acknowledge it at all, that's completely up to you. I'm just sharing what I believe is a very reasonable hypothesis for why the numbers are in decline like they are. That being said, I am going to be talking about membership numbers. This is going to be probably a little bit longer video than normal, and I apologize for that. I know most viewers like smaller, shorter videos, but there's a lot of stuff to cover here, and I don't want to do it halfway. But really, before I talk about this too much more, if you have not read Brother Lance Kennedy's article, Freemasonry is Dying, check out the link below. Give it a read. He talks about the numbers. He goes into details. He quantifies it better than I could ever hope to, and that is not my intention with this post. I have already kind of talked about his article before in another blog post, and this isn't really a rehashing of that. That was more of a prediction of where the numbers are going to go, I think. But this is why. I'm just trying to answer why. This is why I think the numbers are what they are. So on the screen, you can see this nifty little graph that I put together. Really, all I did is I went to the Masonic Service Association of North America's website and pulled up their data for the membership numbers between 1924 and 2017. And it's not really up to date because obviously it's 2019 now. I'm sure we can predict where the trend is going to go. And I really wish we had data before 1924, but we don't. So really what this data shows us is that there was a huge uptick around the late 50s. The high point was in 59, and it has been in a relatively steady decline ever since. This is pretty well known to most of us by now. This is nothing groundbreaking. This is not information most of us aren't aware of. I just really wanted to create some kind of a visualization aid to really drive home the point. You know, if you look at that decline, you can see some minor curves, but you can really tell that it is pretty steady. And I realize even the MSANA recognizes that their data probably isn't 100% accurate, but I think it paints a pretty complete picture. So I want to talk about generations. That's going to be kind of a big focus on this because it ties together with why. If you look at the uptick, let's see, beginning around 1944, those are the silent generation. Those are our great-grandparents or grandparents if they're very old like mine. That's the silent generation. And up around 1959, that is still the silent generation. The baby boomers really didn't come around until 1946. That was when the oldest baby boomers were born. So in 1959, when we were at the height of our membership, that means most baby boomers were around 13 years old. So clearly not old enough to join in any Masonic lodges. And that means that the fluctuation, that huge increase, was caused by the silent generation. Now after 1959, you see a downward slope. And I've talked about that already. It's a pretty steady downward slope. And what's happening here, my interpretation of this, is the membership is trying to return to equilibrium. And what I mean by that is if you look to the left of the graph, again, I wish I had older data, but I do not. But you can tell that it appears that the membership fluctuates, and it fluctuates till about 1942. And then you see a rapid increase, and you gain about 1.5 million members within a very short time span, relatively speaking. So typically in a healthy organization, membership will hover around a certain point. But this is not the case. We had this huge swell of membership, and we gained about 1.5 million people. And then what's happening, my interpretation, is you're seeing a decline. What's really trying to happen at that point is you're trying to return to equilibrium. There's really no indication that the baby boomers were joining in unusually high numbers like their fathers were, but they were joining, obviously, because there's plenty of baby boomers in the fraternity. But they're joining at a normal rate, and what you're seeing is as the silent generation is passing away and becoming leaving the fraternity, you're having the baby boomers that are taking over where their forefathers were, but in regular numbers. So in an ideal world, what we would have seen with the baby boomers joining at a normal rate is once you've got around 3 million members, you would expect to see stability once again. You would expect to see the total membership numbers hovering around 3 million people, but that's not the case. What happened at that point is you had Generation X. They came along, and they had nothing to do with anything that their parents or grandparents were involved in. Generally speaking, we're painting in broad strokes here with all these generations that we're talking about, but they had nothing to do with Freemasonry for the most part. So what happened was the organization was in decline. It was probably about to reach stability, but Generation X never stepped in. They never stepped into the organization. But what's interesting to note is younger generations are interested in fraternity. Millennials are very interested in Freemasonry. And although most Generation Y, or whatever generation they end up being called, are too young to join Freemasonry right now, they are expressing interest also. But we're still declining. We're still losing members. Even though younger men are joining, we have a generation that is once again interested in the fraternity, and they are joining. We are still in decline. The question is why? Why is this still happening? So before we go further, I want to talk about a concept. It's called generational succession. We all know what succession is. Say like you have a noble lord, and he has a young son, and it's his only son. So when this noble lord passes away, his son inherits everything. He inherits the fief, he inherits the castle, and then his son in turn will do the same. This applies to, property, estates, titles, any kind of thing. We know what succession is. Generational succession occurs when an entire generation of people inherit something. In this case, you have an entire generation of men that are constantly replacing the preceding generation of men in Freemasonry, and over time taking on that mantle of stewardship for the organization. And this is a continuous cycle. So you had the silent generation. They took it from their forefathers, and they eventually took over the mantle of Freemasonry. And as soon as they took over that mantle, they started declining in numbers, and you have the baby boomers coming in, and then they would take that mantle, and ideally what would have happened is Generation X would have taken that mantle, and then the millennials, and then Generation Y, and so forth. And this is a slow process. The mantle is slowly handed over. And the benefit of this is it allows an organization to adapt to the times. And what I mean by that is, say for example, the silent generation. They had certain expectations out of Freemasonry. Their generation had certain things that they valued. And that was reflected in the way they ran the organization and the way they ran Freemasonry. And the baby boomers also had their own expectations of the fraternity. They wanted to run it a certain way, but the differences between the silent generation and the baby boomers weren't such in sharp contrast that it was impossible or altogether too difficult for them to push for the changes that they wanted. So the fraternity, adapts slowly over time. And if you disagree, if you take a brother today and you create a time machine and you go back to a Masonic Lodge meeting 300 years ago and you put him in the middle of that meeting, it was going to be a very new experience for him, even if he's been in the fraternity for several decades. Now, with that same idea, if you take a brother from 275 years ago and transplant him back into that 300-year-old lodge, and transplant him back into that lodge from 300 years ago, he'll notice some differences, but he can probably get by. It won't seem so unusual to him. There won't be so many differences that he won't really know what's going on. And this is how I illustrate that Freemasonry changes over time. So obviously, 300 years ago, there's a huge contrast. There's a huge difference in the way Freemasonry was ran. But if you just take a short 25-year interval, yeah, it's different, but it's not too different. So what you would see is a slow, gradual change in the fraternity over time. Nothing too drastic. Nothing that would really make anyone uncomfortable at that point in time. But if you were to be operating lodges like you did 300 years ago today, and turn around and suddenly start suggesting that someone run a lodge like we all know that they're ran now, it'd be still very different from the way it was already ran. There's no way to ever get it to happen. So generational succession is important because it allows the fraternity to adapt to different generational expectations. But what happens if you skip a generation? And that's what happened. We lost Generation X, and so we skipped an entire generation. And so it is my belief that if we can identify the effects that this generational gap created when this line of succession was broken temporarily, then we could probably find out why we're not retaining members and why that slope is still going straight down. So there are 3 results that I really think came from this. And this is where it gets really hard to talk about, because I just want to reiterate, I'm really not trying to make anybody upset. This is not the point of this video. I'm not trying to call anybody out. I'm just trying to approach it from a kind of analytical point of view. This is why it's for y'all to decide what you want to do. So just be warned, if you are easily offended, just stop the video right now. So number 1, because we lost an entire generation, there wasn't a generational succession like you would normally see. Sure, there is one now, or there's trying to be, but it's not quite like it typically is. And what I mean by that is normally the next generation would step in and start being involved and gradually take over stewardship of the organization. But that never happened because the Gen X never joined. So the baby boomers were the stewards of their lodges and their grand lodges for about 40 years. That's a long time. And when you are the majority stakeholder of any organization for a very long period of time, then you're going to have a huge impact on that organization. I would even suggest that the impact you have on that organization is almost all-encompassing. And really, to kind of summarize what that means, is all lodge and grand lodge programs and policies that are now in place all across North America were created by the baby boomers. And I know some people are going to be quick to say that's not true, but when you've been in charge of an organization for 40 years, yes, pretty much everything that we have today was touched by the boomers in some way. So there's that. There's the first result. The second result, when Gen X never joined, the boomers were the primary members of most lodges, like I've talked about. But that also means that they saw no one else coming in. That also means that they watched the generation before them slowly just kind of fade away over time. The only people in the lodges were the boomers. And many lodges, there were not many members to start with. And so we have many, many lodges all across North America that were kept alive by the boomers. The bills were paid by them. The offices were filled by them. Their names are on the registration for every meeting. They kept the fraternity alive. And I know that doesn't sound negative at all, and it's not. It's a terrific thing. I mean, we owe them a great deal of gratitude for keeping the fraternity alive when it probably at sometimes seemed as though it was hopeless. But this also comes with a downside, and that is when you've been in charge of anything for as long as the boomers have been, it's really hard just to hand it off to somebody. And granted, that's not what anyone's asking them to do, but you hear about it all the time. You hear about young men that are enthusiastic. They want to be involved. They want to be heard, and they have ideas. And they are not. They are quickly met with resistance. You'll hear, that's not the way we did it in my day. And after a point, it doesn't matter who it is, they're going to give up and walk away. But the fact is, when a man doesn't feel like his opinions are important, when he feels as though no one cares about his input and they don't want his contributions, then he's going to leave. And this isn't a millennial thing. It's a man thing. Men are meant to have input. They are meant to feel as though they are part of something. And too often, we find certain brothers are excited to have young men join, but as soon as they start having ideas and wanting to contribute and be an actual functioning and helpful member of the organization, they become ostracized very quickly. Yes, they leave. They leave fast. And what they do is they go somewhere else and find somewhere that they are needed and are useful. And number 3, we're going back to that gap in generational succession. And we're going to talk about that. When you have this gap, that means there's a greater difference in generational expectations of the fraternity. Wherein, like before, when I mentioned the silent generation, the baby boomers, there were generational differences and they did impact the fraternity. They weren't drastic differences. Here we're dealing with a generational gap of almost 40 years. And so it's much more difficult to bridge that gap because the differences in expectations is much broader. So in conclusion, I just want to really repeat that this is not intended to be a negative video. I'm not trying to speak poorly of any of my brothers. That's not the case. And honestly, if the millennials were in the same position where we were in control of the organization for 40 years or so, then I would expect to see the same kind of results, where our expectations were just not being reflected in what younger generations were wanting. It's normal. That's completely understandable. So this brings us to why. The question I asked at the very beginning. Why is Freemasonry declining still? Why are we still losing members despite having an interested generation that's trying to join? And the simple answer is that young men are leaving the fraternity because it generally is not providing what they're hoping to find when they join. There's a hole in our bucket and it's losing water faster than we can fill it up. Thank you as always for watching, my brothers, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.